unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. After 2 torturous weeks of around-the-clock negotiations in Glasgow, Scotland, diplomats from nearly 200 countries agreed to accelerate their commitments to reduce carbon emissions, phase out fossil fuels, and ramp up aid to poor countries, many of whom are the biggest victims of the climate crisis. However, not everyone is pleased with the outcome in Glasgow. Climate experts point out that this accord will not put the world on track to avoid catastrophic warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. To discuss the Glasgow Accord, India's commitments, and the questions that remain, I am pleased to be joined on the show today by Navroz Dubash. Navroz is a professor at the Center for Policy Research, CPR, in New Delhi, where he conducts research and writes on climate change, energy, air pollution, water policy, and the politics of regulation in the developing world. For the last quarter century, Navroz has been actively engaged in the climate debate as a scholar, policy advisor, and activist. I'm pleased to welcome him to the show for the very first time. Navroz, good to see you.
Thank you very much, Milan. Really great to be on the show with you.
So I think because many of our listeners may not be following the fine print of what's gone on in Scotland, let's rewind the clock a bit and go back to the 2015 Paris Climate Change Accord, COP21, which will maybe help us put this in context. So if you had to sort of summarize what went down in Paris 6 years ago, what were the sort of 2 or 3 main takeaways from that agreement?
So the Paris Agreement in 2015 was actually a watershed moment of sorts in this now 20, 30-year-long climate negotiation. The key break from the past that emerged from Paris was that instead of trying to get countries to decide, in a sense, how to carve up the carbon pie, internationally sit down around a table and say, here's how much you emit, here's how much you emit, and get them to then sign on to legally binding commitments to those emissions. Paris turned the story around. It said, all right, this kind of agreement is hard to achieve. Let's just try asking every country to say, why don't you come up with what you can achieve? Figure out what story you want to tell nationally and bring that back to the table. And then we will come up with a set of procedures, a set of scrutiny, a set of ways of looking at the collective problems, like how do you finance things, how do you manage technology development, and we will build on, in a sense, those nationally determined contributions, which is what those pledges were called. So Paris really kind of inverted the story. And I think it was actually very significant because it put national economies, it put countries at the center of the stage, rather than the global process. So that was a huge shift, really, in climate negotiations.
But do we have a sense in the intervening 5 or 6 years how the world did? So each country went back home, came up with their own nationally determined contribution, came back and said, this is what we're going to do. If you had to kind of step back and do an assessment, have countries essentially done what they've promised in the intervening period?
Well, Paris was really a bet that a virtuous cycle built on optimism would replace what had become kind of a gaming situation where every country bargained hard to get as much carbon space as possible. And the argument was, well, look, if nothing is going to be shoved down anybody's throat, they'll be more likely to experiment. And that sort of worked in some countries. The problem, of course, was that the post-Paris period coincided with the era of Mr. Trump in the US. It coincided with Mr. Bolsonaro. It coincided with the current Australian Prime Minister. And so you had a series of leaders around the world who weren't really in a mood to experiment around climate change and to put their countries in that position. So that was a bit of a dampener. But actually, I think on the whole, the Paris Agreement is more likely to succeed than the previous version, which said, let's just try and get countries to lock themselves in a globally binding way to some 20, 30-year-long carbon trajectories. So I think if you look at, say, India, which we're going to talk about today, in a sense, post-Paris, there has been a lot more experimentation with energy efficiency. There's been more experimentation around renewable energy. There's been more of a conversation of how you bring climate and development together. In a sense, it's opened up the space because it's a bit less threatening. You don't think somebody's going to shove this down your throat. So I think it's an experiment that's broadly worked. I will say that for a lot of people, the challenge of Paris has been, in a sense, thinking of it as, a beauty contest where everybody brings their own judge. You actually don't have any common agreed benchmark by which you decide whether a country is doing enough. And that is a problem that continues to plague Paris. And that was, I think, part of what we saw going on in Glasgow.
So could I just ask you, before we get into the nitty-gritty of COP26, about India's role? Because in the kind of global story, right, and in the United States where I sit, India has long been seen as a kind of impediment or an obstructor to international climate change negotiations, rightly or wrongly. But Paris really did change that script, right? You started to say, look, India has now put itself in a position where it wants to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Do you think that narrative is broadly correct? And if so, what did India really do 5 or 6 years ago to kind of change that narrative?
I think it's a great question and a great observation. The week before Paris, or maybe the first week of Paris, the New York Times had this cartoon with a train coming down the Paris tracks, and there was a sort of somewhat sleepy-looking Indian elephant lying across the tracks, right? And the Indian Environment Minister was asked about this, as, why do we always see India as this kind of blocker? And he said, well, it depends on your perspective. I sort of see the train running over the Indian elephant. I don't see it blocking. Right. So it was actually an interesting metaphor because it was the first time that India tried to change the conversation a little bit. And in a sense, India has long had a perspective driven by a few seasoned negotiators. And it's interesting enough, some of the stuff really is based on personalities. We've had the same individuals often negotiating for India for 10 and 20 years. Wow. And their perspective was very much that the principle on which we negotiate is actually paramount. And that principle is to, in a sense, defend India against any obligations that might constrain its development choices. That was the primary and almost the only objective. And so often, there would be a joke that when we saw a new proposal, India would say, well, it doesn't matter if it works in practice, does it work in theory? That was always the question. What you saw, in a sense, with the new government in 2014 and around 2015, when Paris happened, is, in a sense, they were willing to say, look at all the stuff we're doing. We are not an obstacle, and we would actually like everybody else to do more. So it was really just a change in the way we talked about things, because India was doing a lot of reasonable stuff before 2014 and 15 too. The solar and energy efficiency programs all happened before then. So in a sense, just fast forwarding a little bit to Glasgow, that's why the Glasgow moment is kind of interesting, because early in this process, it looked like India was pivoting back to something that said, we really don't want to be put on the mat and asked to do things that we're uncomfortable about.
So let's talk about some of the specific provisions in this agreement. So the Glasgow Accord, quote, urges developed country parties to at least double their collective provision of climate finance for adaptation to developing country parties, end quote. This sort of renewed financial commitment, of course, was a key demand emerging from many developing countries. I guess my question to you is, how real is this commitment? Because developed countries time and again have failed to live up to their spending commitments, even from COP21 in Paris, right? And that's actually a reality that the text explicitly calls out. So what do we make of these renewed financial commitments?
Yeah, I think finance is one of those kind of ever-present issues. For India, it's always been part of a kind of a dual agenda, finance and technology from the West in exchange for action from India. And to be honest, a lot of this has been posturing in the sense that if India demands finance, when the finance is not forthcoming, then there's a reason for India to say, well, how could you expect us to act without the finance, right? But then similarly for the West to say, well, if we give you finance, how do we know that you will actually act on it in reasonable ways and won't use the finance as an excuse not to do things that you should have been doing anyway. So the argument, for example, is should climate finance be used for more livable, less congested cities, when that's something that Indians would benefit from anywhere, or similarly with air pollution. And in a sense, the finance discussion has become counterproductive because one side says, show us the additional action, and the other side says, show us the additional finance that is not development finance. When in practice, development and mitigation are really hard to untangle, right? So that's how it's been for a really long time. And the Prime Minister, in his speech on the Monday morning, or rather Monday afternoon of Glasgow, said, look, we're looking at $1 trillion. Now, as you pointed out, what the developed countries had pledged but failed to deliver was $100 billion.
Right.
So he just said $1 trillion. It's a big number. It's a round number. It wasn't clear whether he meant that for India or he meant that for the developing world collectively. But I think what he was trying to say is the accountability now has to run two ways.
Right.
If you keep pressing us for action, we're going to press you for money, and we want a process through which we scrutinize that. And in that sense, I think actually Glasgow has been somewhat different. Now, the adaptation, doubling of adaptation money that you talked about, the amount of money that's sort of on the table at the moment is about 20 billion. So a doubling of it is 40 billion. It's more, but it's not a very large sum of money, really, all told. This is now per year. But there are a number of clauses and there are a number of sort of code words embedded in the text, right, that signal to me that there's something slightly different going on this time, potentially. So the text calls for a procedure to actually a procedure to track finance and to have an ongoing what they call an ad hoc working group on finance. Now, the way in which, just going back to our earlier conversation about the Paris Agreement, the other big shift in Paris was that it called for, in essence, not substantive commitments by countries, but procedural commitments. So countries weren't asked to do things, to make things happen. They were asked to jump hoops. The assumption being that when you jump those hoops, the act of jumping those hoops would change things in your country. It was a different kind of institutional construct. And so here in the finance discussion, creating an ad hoc working group basically creates a platform for an ongoing discussion on finance. It gives us space to make developed countries more and more uncomfortable, and for developing countries to press their case. So that's sort of a very inside baseball kind of point, but I think it's significant. The other thing it does is it opens the door to, in a sense, country-led initiatives. So in other words, it opened the door to these kinds of packages. And India has been actually working with the World Bank to come up with a package around closing coal mines, which is also something along the same lines, right? So it's these kinds of initiatives, I think, that we're going to see more and more of. Whereas the old blocking story on finance was, it's got to be public money, you got to take your taxpayer money and give it to our citizens. And that has always been a hard political sell, especially post the financial crisis, when there just wasn't really much appetite in the West to be sending money overseas.
So let me, before we get to the India-specific details, let me just ask you one more question on the broad picture, right? And you talked about the importance of procedure. One of the key achievements, at least as it's being sold as a key achievement, is sort of speeding up the timeline for climate action. So within a year, as I understand it, countries are going to come back and submit more ambitious plans for cutting emissions. So a skeptic could say, well, this is just sort of kicking the can down the road. Others could say, no, actually, a fire has been lit under major emitters to come back with a program in place to cut emissions significantly over the near term. How do you evaluate this procedural hoop?
So I've always thought that these procedural hoops are much more than just shadow boxing, but for a different reason to that given by most people. Most people think that when countries are asked to come back after every few years. And one of the things they agreed in Paris is that in general, it would be a 5-year cycle when countries come back, but that they would start by doing it next year, as you said, which is significant. Most people think that the benefit of that is it's another opportunity for the public gaze to fall on countries. And so you would have a naming and shaming exercise. Well, to be perfectly honest with you, I think the 4 years of Mr. Trump put paid to the benefits of shaming, right? I mean, when you have a floor of shame that Mr. Trump generated, it gives lots of countries quite enough cover not to feel particularly embarrassed. But even before that, I think the idea that a country could be shamed through international reputational effects to do something that was politically costly at home was always a stretch, right? Maybe at the margins it would work, but generally, countries where you see political support for climate action come up with progressive and ambitious pledges. Where you don't have political support, at the electoral level for climate action, you don't see much. So what is the value then of these procedures? I actually think the real value lies in the shifts it brings about in domestic conversations. So prior to one of these COPs, there is a flurry in India, like in most places. There's a flurry of consultations. Business is called in to ask what they think. Ministries like the Ministry of Environment suddenly become more important. They get to have consultations with other ministries backed by the Prime Minister's office, who says, you got to show up to this because whatever this ministry says is going to be repeated at an international forum. Enterprising bureaucrats suddenly find openings for creative ideas because you have to find something new to say. And so the whole kind of bureaucratic and social machinery springs into action. Every think tank worth their salt comes out with modeling studies. They put them out there. They critique each other. Op-eds fly around. And actually it creates kind of hooks and crannies in the domestic institutional and political process to advance a conversation, right? And I think that's what's productive. So, for example, in the build-up to COP, there were people running around going, we need an effort for a just transition for coal communities in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh and Bihar, right? Because this is an opportunity for India to showcase that sort of effort. The One Sun, One World, One Grid idea kind of flourished and flowered, as did the solar mission before a COP. So that, I think, is actually what's useful about these things. And the fact that we will have one again in a year, I think is actually productive. I'm among those who thinks it's a good idea.
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So, to get to the India-specific commitments, in Glasgow, Prime Minister Modi announced that India would cut its emissions to net zero by the year 2070. Now, that is later than the 2050 target many had advocated for, but this announcement was still praised as a step forward, given it was the first time India had gone on record to set a net zero target. This was part of a larger package the Prime Minister announced in Scotland. I know you have questions about what was announced, and we'll get to that in a second, but sort of what do we know from what the Prime Minister said about kind of what India's, headline commitment is going to be?
Well, there had been a consistent drumbeat of political pressure in the build-up to Glasgow. Mr. Kerry came to India, Mr. Alok Sharma came to India, and it was very clear in the middle of the year that the ask of India was a net zero pledge. India was, I believe, the last G20 country that had not come up with a pledge. Certainly among the top half dozen emitters on an annual basis, India was the one without a net zero pledge. And as you said, the IPCC and other bodies have argued that global average emissions have to reach net zero, that is the emissions minus the sinks or the absorption of carbon dioxide, by 2050. And we're talking about carbon dioxide here, incidentally. Some countries have their pledges in terms of greenhouse gases versus carbon dioxide, but in most cases it's carbon dioxide. Now, the diplomatic pressure was enormous because the larger narrative for Glasgow was we have to maintain 1.5 degrees as still feasible. Now, how do you know if it's feasible? In a sense, you need some way of running the numbers off into the next 30, 40, 50 years, right? And the only way to do that is for countries to say where they will be by around 2050 or shortly thereafterwards. So what was interesting about this is because of the statement of political success, which was about 1.5, the requirement for a pledge that could be benchmarked against that statement became a net zero pledge. So if a country said, we will shut down all our coal plants tomorrow and we will do all kinds of things in the next 10 years, it still wouldn't have been able to be translated into its implications for 1.5 in the same kind of way, right? So in a sense, one reason I frankly have been somewhat critical of this unitary push for net zero pledges, because I think that these things play differently in different countries. If you're a European country which has peaked its emissions and you need to try and decline as fast as possible, and you have a supportive population, it's a really good way of having a national conversation. In a country like India, where emissions are going up and you're starting at a very low level of energy use, probably a tenth or so per capita of the US and other places, you need to increase energy. And you don't know yet if all that additional energy can come from low carbon sources. So what do? You kind of string it off into the future, right? So that's what India did. And it was a reasonable response to pressure and to a diplomatic full court press. If you want to be cynical about it, you could also even say that India just applied what it often does in climate negotiations, the China plus 10 rule. China said it would have net zero in 2060. We said, we'll do it in 2070. And we've done this. We've done this before. China had a 45% intensity target at Paris. We have a 45% intensity target now. We had 33%, 35%. They had 45%. It's the China plus 10 rule. You see it show up again and again, assuming that basically India is kind of at least a decade behind China in developmental terms. So it's basically just saying, look, we'll push this off into the future, so it is unlikely to constrain us very much. The problem is a pledge for 2070 really going to change what a policymaker decides today? Right? It's like saying in 1970 that you can envision what the world would have been like today.
Right.
In 1970, we didn't have the personal computer, let alone the mobile device. We were still in the middle of the Cold War. Oil was $3 a barrel. I mean, there was no way to predict. And I think we're in a similar situation now. If anything, technology has sped up. So to me, it's not, I think the international community was asking the wrong question.
Right.
For a country like India, what you want to see is that you meet your energy needs without locking into high carbon infrastructure. That's what we should have been asked to bring to the table, not a hollow net zero pledge for 2070.
When, by the way, the politicians who are currently in power, of course, will presumably be long gone. So we had the BJP MP Jayant Sinha on the show several weeks ago talking about the importance of a net zero pledge. And I had asked him in that episode, if India were to make a big net zero promise, which would give it a diplomatic win, but if it wasn't seen as delivering, would that essentially erode India's credibility? And he said no. He thought that India could live up to that. But I was intrigued by a line that you had in your recent column for the Hindustan Times, and we'll link to that, in which you noted that the diplomatic gain India might have achieved through this net zero pledge was somewhat eroded by the fact that there were several elements key to understanding what India had actually pledged that were pretty unclear. What are some of those areas of uncertainty or opacity or lack of clarity?
Yeah, there was. So the Prime Minister had five concrete statements, one of them being net zero. And the others, a cottage industry quickly sprang up to try and understand exactly what the implications of some of those were. And it's still a little confusing as to why they were phrased in such a way. And, look, fair enough. This is a prime minister speaking. You can't expect him or her, in this case, of course, him, to go into all the details. But then you expect a bureaucratic document to come up pretty quickly, right, to specify what was going on.
Correct.
So I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the pledge elements said that we will reduce India's emissions by 1 billion tons by 2030, right? Now, whether that is 1 billion tons in 2030 or whether that is 1 billion tons between 2020 and 2030 makes a really big difference. The former is essentially a peaking of India's emissions. And in fact, Lord Nick Stern read it that way and was like, my goodness, India's just agreed to peak, which is a very big deal in climate speak, of course. The Ministry of External Affairs then had to come out and clarify, no, we actually meant that this is a cumulative reduction. Okay, fine, it's a cumulative reduction. But a cumulative reduction from what? Right? So many countries have, in fact, come up with these deviation from business as usual pledges. But that then means that you had to have an understanding, an agreed understanding on what emissions would have been in the absence of the pledge.
Right.
And then count down from that.
So you sort of see these curves, right, where it's sort
That's
of,
right.
Linear sort of curve, and then the things bending downwards and so on and so forth.
That's right. But the trick here is you have not just one curve. Every modeling group and every think tank has their own curve.
Right.
Some of them are higher than others. If you pick a high curve, it's pretty easy to reduce.
Right.
If you pick a low curve, it's really hard to reduce. Right? So you can't actually assess whether this was ambitious or not. And unfortunately, the game in town, in sort of the climate saloon, really, is independent groups, tracker groups of various sorts that count up what a country has done. And if you don't really know what the country has said, it's very hard to actually, there's scope to just interpret it in ways that are deleterious to that country's interests. So I think it's in India's interest to be a bit more precise. Let me give the biggest example here is on the renewable energy side. India actually had two pledges. So many people, including myself, assumed one was about the electricity, renewable energy capacity, so the plants you build, and the other was about generation, which is not what you build, but how much you actually generate and use, right? That would have made sense. But the generation one was suspiciously stringent, really, really tough. And so it looked hugely ambitious, right? It would have been a real reach for India to get there. Again, the MEA came out, the Ministry of External Affairs, and said, no, we meant it in capacity terms. So now you had two capacity pledges, one in terms of 50% of renewable energy, the other in terms of 500 gigawatts, right? So one in terms of proportion and one in terms of absolute numbers. And when you put those two things together, you could actually then read that as saying, okay, 50% is renewable energy, then the other 50% is probably going to be what? Well, coal and oil.
Right.
And that 50% has to be 500 gigawatts because that's the other pledge. In which case, India has just actually given a pledge that suggests it has the headroom to almost double its coal fleet. Now, I'm not sure that's what they intended to say, but when you put those two together, you could make that interpretation. So in a sense, I think, the careful parsing of statements is really important in these diplomatic settings. And I'll just say one more quick thing about it. To me, the main lesson is that we still haven't got a institutional structure in place at home in India where we are looking at this as really a marathon. We're going to have to come up with these pledges year in and year out. We're going to have to defend them every 5 years. We're going to have to report against them. This is for the next few decades. Mm-hmm. We can't be doing this on an ad hoc basis where we call in a different modeling group. We have a particular set of experts, then they move on. Different subsets of bureaucrats come in depending on who's holding the seat at the moment. We can't play the game like that anymore. And I think we need to have an institutional structure that allows for cooperation across different government units, cooperation with think tanks, with the business community, and so on. So we stitch together a narrative well before these COPs.
So let me ask you about another way in which India made news at this summit, and it happened sort of at the 11th hour where a fight broke out. China and India, speaking on behalf of a group of other developing countries, forced for an amendment on the language on coal, stating that there should be a quote-unquote phase down of coal power and fossil fuel subsidies rather than a quote-unquote phase out. Now, for those of us who are not climate experts, this sort of seems like, a silly game of semantics, but this really raised the ire of a lot of countries who were pushing for more stringent action. So was India kind of portrayed as the bad guy here?
I think we were substantially portrayed by the global media as the bad guy. I think interestingly, a lot of Western civil society organizations leapt to India's aid, and I think rightfully so. So let me step back here, right? I mean, look, I've engaged in the Indian policy debate. Part of what I do is try and kind of, serve as kind of the loyal opposition in a sense and critique and improve what India does. But I think it's really important here to note that some of these efforts were incredibly duplicitous on the part of the West, right? Many of these countries have, in a sense, been able to shrink their dependence on coal. They haven't yet shrunk their dependence on oil and gas. So it's kind of convenient to talk about coal, but not oil and gas. The US is still trying to export gas on the back of all its shale assets and discoveries, right? And that's, of course, gas emits less than coal, but it's still a fossil fuel, and it still locks in a fossil fuel future.
Right.
The fact, even with the as you mentioned earlier on the show, Milan, this 2017 net zero target versus 2050 ignores entirely the fact that the problem is substantially caused by the West.
Right.
The US by itself probably accounts for 20-25% of cumulative emissions versus 3% for a country like India. The West hasn't brought money to the table, so these are well-worn, kind of well-rehearsed reasons in climate politics. Now, in my own view, what India did, I can understand the political argument, right? Which is that we need to provide energy to our population. We may need to use coal. We hope we don't, but we may need to use coal for a while longer. We can't tell you exactly when we can stop. Therefore, phase down is an easier sell than phase out. Though, frankly, phase out didn't have a target date, so it probably didn't mean that much. But these things always work with thin end of the wedge and ratchet type devices, right? But what was more interesting is the language of phase down was actually a direct lift from the US-China statement, which came out the Wednesday of the final week.
And this is just as an interjection, the U.S. and China kind of surprised a lot of observers by announcing their own kind of mini agreement midway through the sort of COP process.
That's right, and it's in a tradition here, right? So right before a year before Paris, the U.S. and China had a similar kind of aha moment.
That's right,
where they actually framed the contours of the Paris Agreement, and some of the key difficult issues were resolved in text between those two countries and lifted directly and put in the Paris Agreement. So in a sense, the broader geopolitical tension between China and the US, of course, has been much higher this time around. But this was an effort, in the sense, to rekindle those embers. But so the phase down language came from that agreement. And it was somewhat choreographed because right before India, China spoke and said, well, we can live with all this, but of course, we would love to see language that echoes broader agreements, such as the US-China statement, such as the G20, and so on and so forth. And then it was left to India to actually pull the trigger and say, we propose phase down as opposed to phase out. Now, it probably makes some difference to India for the reasons I said, right? That India needs to feel that it's not constrained on its coal use. And look, I personally think India is not going to build very many more coal-fired power plants. India is not going to be the next China just because of market forces. It's just not cost-effective. It's not a profit-making technology, especially if you spin it out 20 or 30 years 30 or 40 years, which is the life of a coal-fired power plant. And it's in India's interest to start thinking about this transition in the way that South Africa has. So I don't know whether it was that essential for India to make this statement, but I'm willing to understand, and I do understand the logic behind it. What I'm really not sure about, though, is whether India really should have been the diplomatic fall guy for this.
Right.
And I have to say, I always think of a statement from a Chinese colleague of mine who, this has happened before, where India is in the forefront. It happened at Durban back in 2012, and China and the US are sort of hanging back. And I asked this Chinese colleague about this once, and he said, he kind of paused and he said, well, we have a saying in China. He said, without the upper lip, the teeth get cold. I can't help thinking that this was much more important for China. I'm not saying it wasn't important for India,
right,
but this was straight out of the China-US playbook. And the US has escaped cotton. They agreed to that language, right? So it's a little. It seems. It makes me wonder a little bit. It does seem like a move that needs to be thought through from a developmental point of view, but also from a diplomatic point of view.
So this is a very nice segue to sort of wrapping up this conversation. Since I am sitting here at Washington, D.C., and we've just been talking about the role of the United States, I can't resist but sort of ask you a question about the role of the U.S. Obviously, there has been a sea change in mindset since the Biden administration came to power, right? So the administration had a full court press in action at Glasgow. I think they had 13 cabinet ministers. They were everywhere, right? The U.S. and China announced this mini deal, as we discussed. On the other hand, the data is pretty clear that the U.S. has not lived up to its financial commitments to help developing countries, but it also hasn't really done enough to address the climate threat here at home, right? I mean, climate change is a just completely fraught political issue in this country. How would you characterize the role of the United States kind of in the global realm of climate diplomacy? Where do things stand today?
Well, since the Trump administration gave way to the Biden administration, and I think many people have observed that many of the Biden climate warriors are actually sort of Obama-era officials. I wasn't at Glasgow this time around, but I have read a lot of accounts that the style was very similar, that in a sense there was an approach that said, look, we can kind of frame the conversation, we can hector and corral countries into this and that and the other. And I think that there's a real sense in which the Trump years have, the Trump years plus the walking away, in a sense, from the Kyoto Protocol from way back when by the US, have really left a credibility deficit that, to his credit, Mr. Kerry was well aware of. And he talked about the fact that, we realize we can't just walk in here. We have to, in a sense, deliver at home. But I think Mr. Biden's in a tough place because his ability to deliver at home is really compromised by fraught domestic politics and by the culture wars in the US. So given that, I think they're trying to square this impossible circle of rebuilding credibility in the international realm before they've actually delivered at home. And the world used to be willing to build agreements around what it would take to bring the US on board because the US was the biggest emitter. It was the technology powerhouse. Well, I have to wonder whether we should be thinking about building these agreements to persuade China to change. Because actually, from a climate point of view, they're much more significant now, what they do. Their potential to diminish their emissions fast is much greater than the US. So I think the US is in a difficult place. They're still playing from the same playbook as if they had the credibility. But if Mr. Biden cannot deliver something substantial domestically, I think it's going to be even harder the next time around. And frankly, if you look at the Glasgow COP, India eventually gave a net zero pledge. We agreed to a statement about coal, phase down or phase out. It was still a statement about coal, really significant for a country with 1.9 tons of emissions per person versus 15 tons in the US, right? What exactly did the US give? There wasn't a hard commitment of any additional money. There was something that the US has historically been very resistant to, which is a legal obligation for what is called loss and damage, which has overtones of legal liability for the impacts of climate change, something which the US lawyers absolutely don't let pass through. So they've sort of pushed back on the loss and damage story. As I said, nothing on finance. No real... they came up with an enhanced NDC, they came up with a long-term target, but it's really an open question as to whether they will deliver on this. So I think the US as in a sense, as the, I think likes to think of itself as the guardian angel in these events, as sort of, the steward of progress. It's not an image that actually sits easily with the empirical evidence.
Well, we have a phrase that we regularly throw around here: "Do as I say, not as I do." Right, which the United States has perfected that art. My guest on the show this week is Navroz Dubash. He is a professor at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. He is one of India's leading voices in the climate and energy debate. Navroz, so good to see you. Thanks so much for meticulously laying this out, making sense of this very complicated text, which lay people like myself have struggled to understand. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Milan. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest-growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth, Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff Jayapranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.